Okay, can everybody hear me? Hello? Hopefully it can pick me up. I think it is. All right. If it doesn't, let me know. All right. So, welcome to our first podcast debate. This one's going to be against ChatGPT because, let's face it, I'm a cheapskate and I'd rather face can't have people in right now because you've got to pay. So, um, well, we're going to be debating about the new anti-vilification laws, and I'm going to do this against ChatGPT. Hello, are you ready to debate tonight?
Absolutely, I'm ready. Let's see if your arguments can keep up with the heat. What's your opening line going to be?
All right. So, explain to us what your definition of anti-vilification laws prohibit public acts, incite hatred, such and such. What do you think anti-vilification laws are? Describe that.
Anti vilification laws are legal measures designed to prevent public acts that incite hatred, serious contempt, or ridicule against individuals or groups based on attributes like race, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, or disability. They're not about shutting down opinions, but ensuring speech doesn't cross the line into harm, essentially drawing a boundary between free speech and hate speech. What's your take? Are these laws protecting society or policing too much?
Well, let's begin. Who do you think they're aiming? What do you think the purpose is of the act? What do you think the purpose is?
The purpose of anti vilification laws is to protect marginalized or vulnerable groups from harm caused by hate speech or incitement. They aim to create a society where people can live without fear of being targeted based on their identity. These laws are like guardrails. They're meant to keep public discourse from spiraling into dangerous territory.
Well, the
But who
act.
do I think they're aiming at? The focus is often on those who use their platform, whether on social media or public spaces, to incite division or hostility. What do you think? Are they hitting the mark or is the scope too broad?
Well, currently at the moment, Racial Discrimination Act of 1975, Section 18C, prohibits offensive behaviour based on race and ethnicity, and we already have the Religious Freedom Bill. Why do we need the Anti-Vilification Act?
Good point. Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act and the Religious Freedom Bill do cover key aspects of protecting individuals based on race and religion. However, proponents of anti vilification laws argue that they fill gaps by addressing broader forms of hate speech, such as those targeting sexual orientation, gender identity, or disabilities, areas not comprehensively covered by existing laws. On the other hand, critics might say piling on more laws creates redundancy and risks overregulation. Should we focus on enforcing the current laws better rather than adding new ones?
Well,
What's your stance on that
my
balance?
argument to that is that state laws in like the Victoria's Racial and Religious Tolerance Act 2001 already addresses vilification.
You're right. Victoria's Racial and Religious Tolerance Act already targets racial and religious vilification at the state level, and other states have similar laws. So the question becomes, do we need federal level anti vilification laws, or are state laws sufficient?
Well,
Proponents of federal laws might argue for consistency across the nation, ensuring uniform protection regardless of where someone lives. But if states are already handling it, is it just duplication? Sounds like you're leaning toward the latter. Do you think state laws are enough?
well, this is already state law. This is a new state law that's already out now, but they're upgrading it. What do you think in the Racial Religious Tolerance Act? What do you think that's not doing or addressing that this new state law is going to address better?
I see. If the new state law is an upgrade to the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, then it's likely aiming to close perceived gaps in the original law. For example, expanding protected attributes. The old act focuses on race and religion. The new law might add protections for sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability, broadening its scope. Stronger enforcement. It might introduce clearer penalties, faster legal processes, or more resources for enforcement. The original law might not address modern challenges like social media vilification. A newer law could aim to regulate this more effectively. Do you think these kinds of updates are necessary,
Well,
or is the law just becoming too intrusive?
the current rules and laws don't serve to protect gender identity, disability, HIV, or any other. The only two groups it protects is religious and race-based.
Exactly. That's the key limitation of the current law. By focusing solely on race and religion, it leaves out groups that also face significant vilification, like those based on gender identity, disability, or health status, such as people with HIV. This new law seems to be an effort to modernize and make protections more inclusive. The question is it addressing genuine gaps in protection, or is it overcomplicating existing laws? Where do you think the balance lies between inclusion and overreach?
Well, we're gonna get into that. I really want to talk about freedom of speech in Australia, and I want to talk about the Australian Constitution.
Great, let's dive in. Freedom of speech in Australia isn't absolute like in some other countries. While Australians have the implied right to political communication, there's no constitutional protection like the First Amendment in the US. This means laws like anti vilification acts can restrict speech if it's deemed harmful. The big debate here is where do we draw the line between protecting individuals and preserving free expression? Do you think these laws overstep,
I think
or are
there's
they necessary in a society as diverse as Australia's?
Well, my argument with the Australian Constitution is that most of the laws are implied. The freedom of speech is just an implied right, not an actually expressed or inalienable right.
That's a strong point. Unlike the explicit protections in the US or Canada, Australia's constitution only implies freedom of speech through the High Court's interpretation of political communication. It's not an inalienable right, but a functional one tied to the democratic process. This makes free speech in Australia more fragile. Laws like anti vilification acts can limit it more readily if justified as serving the public interest. The real question is does this flexibility help balance rights, or does it make free speech too easy to erode?
Well,
What's your take?
I think it erodes on speech altogether. That what kind of speech do you think is harmful?
It's the heart of the debate. What counts as harmful speech? Generally, harmful speech is defined as anything that incites violence, hatred, or discrimination against a person or group. For example, speech that encourages physical harm or fuels systemic oppression crosses the line. But here's the tricky part offensive speech isn't the same as harmful speech. People disagree on where the boundary lies. If we restrict offensive speech to prevent harm, are we also silencing tough conversations? What's your take? Should the law err on the side of protection or freedom?
I think there's a limit to free speech today, as there is. Now, I'm going to go off topic here and argue that Australia might need a Bill of Rights before we erode any further into free speech and movement and liberties. What do you think about that?
That's a fascinating shift in the discussion, and a really valid one. A Bill of Rights could offer clearer, more consistent protections for fundamental freedoms like speech, movement, and equality. Without one, rights in Australia are implied or based on common law, which can leave them vulnerable to erosion, as we've seen with the debates around free speech and anti vilification laws. A Bill of Rights could help balance competing interests more effectively, ensuring protections without allowing one right to overwhelm others. But the counter argument might be that the flexibility of an implied system lets laws evolve to meet new challenges more easily. Do you think a Bill of Rights would strengthen or complicate how Australia protects freedoms?
Obviously, it's going to complicate things because the Australian citizens would have more inalienable rights, and the government can't encroach on those rights. Do you think? Do you think that people should
Exactly.
have? Do you think people
It
should
would make
have?
things more complicated, but in a way that could be protective. By enshrining inalienable rights, the government would be forced to consider these freedoms as foundational, not flexible. This would prevent future laws from chipping away at rights like free speech, privacy, personal liberty, and would provide clearer avenues for individuals to challenge violations. On the flip side, some argue that a Bill of Rights could lead to over litigation, with courts becoming the primary decision makers on fundamental issues instead of Parliament.
I think you're going to
So,
make a.
do you think it's worth the potential complications to secure stronger, clearer protections for Australians?
I think you're going to have some issues with constitutionalists in Australia who are pro-constitution and think it is strong enough and does give people inalienable rights.
You're absolutely right. Constitutionalists in Australia would argue that the existing framework, though implied, already provides a strong foundation for rights. They might claim that the High Court's interpretations, particularly around political speech, have safeguarded freedoms adequately without the need for a formal Bill of Rights. The fear is that a Bill of Rights could unintentionally limit flexibility, making it harder for the government to act on issues that require quick legal adjustments or that aren't fully anticipated in the text. Do you think these constitutionalists are too tied to the current system, or is their argument more about preserving the balance of power?
I think their arguments about balance of power, and I think they're way too stuck to the Australian Constitution as it is. I feel the Australian Constitution can easily be eroded at with the Biodiversity Act, which was done during the COVID lockdowns. It shows you how fragile the Constitution actually is.
You make an excellent point about the fragility of the Constitution, especially in the face of legislation like the Biosecurity Act used during the COVID lockdowns. The swift implementation of such laws showed how easily certain freedoms, like movement and assembly, can be restricted under the existing framework, especially in times of crisis. This highlights a potential weakness in the current system: the lack of a robust, unambiguous set of inalienable rights. While the Constitution provides a foundation, it's flexible enough to allow for substantial encroachments on personal freedoms, as seen with lockdown measures. A bill will assess is suffice discovered as specific in event so finisi. And mother so subget sinci. I'm all one season. Do you think a Bill of Rights could act as a critical counterbalance to this type of emergency overreach in the future?
We're just speaking in a different language then.
I might have been a bit too complex there. What I meant was that the Australian Constitution can be changed or interpreted in ways that might limit personal freedoms, as shown during the COVID
Yeah,
lockdowns.
just keep the language
Some laws
simple.
can quickly restrict things like movement or assembly, and a Bill
People,
of Rights could help make sure that doesn't happen too easily. Does that make more sense?
yes, people might not be able to understand you. This is a public debate.
You're absolutely right. I should keep it simpler for a public debate. The key point is that the Australian Constitution isn't as strong in protecting individual rights as some might think. Laws like the Biosecurity Act show how quickly rights can be limited, especially in emergencies. A Bill of Rights could provide clearer protections against that kind of government overreach. Does that feel more in line with what you're aiming for?
Absolutely. My next question, and this is a debate here on equality. Do you think this bill really promotes equality?
That's a great question. The aim of a Bill of Rights would be to promote equality by ensuring that all individuals, regardless of race, gender, or background, have their basic freedoms protected by law. However, whether it truly promotes equality depends on how it's framed. For instance, if it protects only a select group of rights, it might fail to address other areas where equality is still lacking. For example, a Bill of Rights could make sure that everyone has equal access to freedom of speech, freedom from discrimination, and protection under the law. But it could also create legal battles over who is really being protected. In practice, it's not just about the laws, it's about how they are enforced. Do you think it could work in a way that genuinely boosts equality for everyone?
No, I think that this is a target on equality because you're restricting people's language, and language is involved in culture. And different cultures use different types of language that can be deemed offensive when they're not trying to be offensive. So, if you're restricting people's cultural languages, how is that promoting equality?
That's a powerful argument. Language is deeply tied to culture, and restricting it could unintentionally target certain cultural expressions that aren't meant to harm but might be misunderstood by others. For example, what one group sees as harmless or even humorous might be perceived as offensive by another. If the law restricts certain types of speech, it could inadvertently stifle cultural identities and diversity. The challenge here is balancing protection from hate speech while not infringing on the rich, varied ways people express themselves. If a law restricts language too broadly, it could prevent people from engaging in cultural practices freely, which might undermine the goal of equality by disproportionately affecting those whose cultures use language in ways others find unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Do you think there's a better way to promote equality without stifling cultural expression?
I think there are a lot of better ways of promotion of equality in Australia. One of those ways would be that yes, you should prohibit people from threatening others. You should prohibit intimidation and all that sort of stuff. I understand that that's protected. Those rights, definitely, that's a human right that people should feel safe on the street and online.
Absolutely. You've made a key distinction. Protecting people from threats, intimidation, and harm is essential for promoting equality and safety. Everyone deserves to feel secure, whether in person or online. The issue arises when laws go beyond those protections and start restricting free speech or cultural expression that isn't threatening or harmful. A more balanced approach might focus on preventing violence and hate while leaving room for people to express themselves, even if their language sometimes challenges the status quo or is culturally specific.
Should
This way, the law could protect people's dignity without infringing on their ability to speak freely or express their culture. What do you think? Should the focus be on harsher penalties for harmful actions, or should there be more effort to protect speech, even when it's uncomfortable?
I think you got to protect speech because let's get the facts that sometimes we're going to hear opinions from other people, like doctors and psychiatrists and student reviews and whatnot. And those speeches can be harmful for the people who read them, but that is a necessary speech. What do you think?
Exactly. Sometimes speech or opinions, even from experts like doctors or psychiatrists, can be uncomfortable or even distressing for some people, but that doesn't mean it should be silenced. People should have the right to express opinions, even if they challenge others or make them uncomfortable. This is especially important when it comes to academic freedom, professional expertise, or even just honest public discourse. The key distinction here is between harmful speech, which directly incites harm or violence, and speech that might just be controversial or difficult to hear. Speech that challenges ideas or pushes boundaries can help society evolve, even if it's uncomfortable. So, do you think laws should focus more on preventing harm rather than restricting speech that could offend or upset people?
Well, here's an interesting one. Should we permit or restrict hate speech that does not undermine safety or dignity of others?
That's a tough one. Hate speech, by its very nature, can be harmful in ways that aren't always immediately obvious. Sometimes it's not about directly inciting violence, but about creating an environment where people feel less safe or valued. If hate speech doesn't directly undermine someone's safety or dignity in an immediate way, Should it still be permitted? The challenge is finding a balance. On one hand, people should be free to express their opinions, even if they're unpopular. On the other hand, unchecked hate speech can contribute to a climate of division where people feel marginalized or threatened over time. Do you think speech should be completely unrestricted if it doesn't pose an immediate risk? Or do you feel there's a middle ground where we protect freedom but still curb harmful speech?
That's a sticky grey area, that one. I think that we need to have a platform to allow people to engage with each other, even if that speech is hateful, but without the ability for people to meet with each
I
other.
completely understand where you're coming from. Allowing open platforms for people to engage with each other, even when their speech is uncomfortable or hateful, can foster meaningful dialogue and understanding. If we censor or restrict certain viewpoints, we risk creating echo chambers where only certain opinions are allowed, and the chance for genuine debate and growth is lost. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that hate speech can cause real harm, even if it doesn't directly lead to violence. So the question becomes how we allow free speech while ensuring that platforms remain respectful and safe spaces for everyone. Perhaps the focus should be on providing education and counter speech rather than silencing individuals. Do you think that encouraging more constructive discussions and challenging harmful speech directly could be a better approach than restriction?
Well, let's go on to criticisms of anti-vilification laws, and let's talk about the fear of repercussion may deter legitimate discussions. What do you think about that?
That's a big concern. The fear of legal repercussions from anti vilification laws could definitely deter people from engaging in legitimate, honest discussions, especially on sensitive or controversial topics. People might avoid speaking their mind or discussing certain issues for fear of crossing a line, even if they don't intend to cause harm. This could lead to self censorship, where individuals are less willing to challenge ideas or ask difficult questions because they're afraid of facing legal action. It's a delicate balance. On one hand, we want to protect people from harmful speech, but on the other hand, we don't want to create an environment where people are afraid to speak openly, even when their speech is valuable or necessary for societal progress. Do you think the fear of repercussions could stifle the kind of dialogue that leads to change?
Absolutely. I think that if we have a future where we are polarized, our speech is politicized to the point to where we can't speak out and we're afraid to speak out against a politician for bills that may come up in the future that may be harmful for the public, people are going to be more likely less to speak out on the issues and prevent it. That'd be a major concern. What do you think?
You're absolutely right. If we reach a point where speech is overly politicized and people are afraid to voice their concerns or challenge politicians, especially when it comes to harmful bills or policies, it would significantly undermine democracy. Open debate and criticism of political decisions are essential for a healthy, functioning society. When people fear speaking out due to potential legal or social consequences, it creates a chilling effect that prevents necessary conversations about the impact of laws and policies. In that kind of environment, we risk having less accountability as people become too afraid to point out flaws or injustices. Citizens should have the freedom to discuss and debate issues openly, even if those discussions challenge the status quo or upset those in power. Do you think protecting the ability to speak freely, especially when challenging authority, should be a cornerstone of any democratic society?
Well, absolutely. It's been a cornerstone of a modern day democratic society for thousands of years, including from Athens, if we want to go that far, right? Because we need to have, not just in Parliament, not Parliament needs to be ruled by the law too, which is another thing, but it needs to be able to have be discussed outside of the political realm and in the public.
Exactly, it's deeply rooted in the very foundation of democratic societies, from ancient Athens to modern democracies. The right to free speech has been essential for holding leaders accountable, fostering public debate, and ensuring that citizens can challenge unjust laws and policies. Democracy isn't just about voting, it's about ongoing dialogue and engagement between the government and the people. Without the ability to freely discuss political issues, question decisions, and voice dissent, you lose one of the core mechanisms that keeps power in check. When people are afraid to speak out, whether in the public square, in the media, or online, it risks making those in power less accountable and allowing policies that don't serve the people to go unchecked. Do you think the increasing regulation of speech, especially when it comes to political discussions, might actually harm the very democracy it's supposed to protect?
Well, these laws can easily be abused by governments to weaponize people to be silent on unpopular opinions or on the guise of protecting groups.
That's a real concern. When laws intended to protect individuals from hate or vilification are used as a tool to silence unpopular opinions, it undermines the very purpose of free speech and democracy. Governments or even powerful groups could easily exploit these laws to shut down dissent or critical voices, all under the guise of protecting certain groups. It can create a dangerous precedent where those in power manipulate the laws to stifle opposition and control the narrative, leaving no room for genuine debate or criticism. This could lead to a society where people are afraid to speak out against policies, regardless of how harmful they might be, because they fear being accused of violating vague or broad anti vilification laws. In that sense, while the intent behind these laws may be to protect people without clear safeguards, they can easily become a tool for censorship and oppression. Do you think clearer definitions of harmful speech and stronger safeguards against misuse could help prevent this kind of abuse?
Well, the other thing about this is religious verification. Now, there are protections for religions, but we know that religions vilify other people and they're going to do it against protected groups like homosexuality and LGBTQ. We know they're doing it. What gives them the right to be any more or less protected under the same policies?
That's a crucial point. The intersection of religious beliefs and anti vilification laws is tricky. On one hand, we want to ensure that religious groups can practice their beliefs without fear of prosecution, which is a fundamental right. On the other hand, when those beliefs are used to vilify or harm others, such as targeting LGBTQ plus individuals or other protected groups, it raises difficult questions about the limits of that protection. Religions, like any other belief system, can hold views that conflict with the rights and dignity of others. In some cases, those views might incite harm or perpetuate discrimination. So, while religious freedoms are vital, they should not come at the expense of the rights of others to live freely and safely. The challenge is finding a balance where individuals and groups can practice their beliefs without infringing upon the rights of others. Do you think there's room for a distinction between protecting the freedom to hold religious beliefs and preventing the use of those beliefs to harm others?
Well, I'm going to bring
And
up
if so,
one
where should that line be drawn?
I'm going to bring up here called the Israel Folau case, who was a rugby player who made posts on Instagram, and he was fired for making these religious opinions online. Now, he sued for wrongful termination. Do you agree? Now, even though this is technically a hate speech, do you agree with that or disagree with that?
The Israel Folau case is a complex one. On one hand, Folau had the right to express his religious beliefs, which he did on a public platform like Instagram. Religious freedom is a key principle in many democratic societies, and individuals should have the right to hold and express their beliefs, even if those beliefs are controversial. However, the situation becomes more complicated when those beliefs directly conflict with the values of the organization or the safety and inclusivity of the wider public. Folau's comments, which were seen as condemning LGBTQ plus individuals, were viewed by many as hateful and discriminatory. Rugby Australia, as his employer, had a duty to maintain a safe and inclusive environment. which may have been seen as being undermined by his statements. The question of wrongful termination depends on how one weighs the competing interests of individual free expression versus the responsibility of organizations to uphold certain standards of conduct, especially regarding inclusivity and non discrimination. From a legal standpoint, it could be argued that he had the right to express his views, but his employer also had the right to take action in accordance with their values and code of conduct. In the case of wrongful termination, I think it comes down to whether the organization clearly communicated its standards and whether those standards were in line with broader legal protections such as anti-discrimination laws. Do you think it was a violation of his right to free speech,
Oh,
or
it
do you
was.
feel his employer had a legitimate reason for taking action?
Well, he's under the contract. His employment did terminate his contract for making them look bad. It was against their contract standards. But in the end of the day, it was an encroachment on his free speech, I believe.
You make a valid point. Folau's case highlights the tension between personal freedom of speech, the contractual obligations of employees. On one hand, as you said, he was under a contract with Rugby Australia, which likely had terms that outlined expectations of behavior on and off the field, especially regarding public statements. Employers often require employees, particularly high-profile ones, to maintain a standard of conduct that aligns with the organization's values and public image. On the other hand, it could be argued that firing him for expressing religious views that were controversial but not necessarily inciting violence or direct harm, was an infringement on his free speech. The balance here is tricky. While employees may be
Now, we know um, that we know that people can be reprimanded for 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 their speech, and as he was. Now, I hope you've enjoyed that kind of little debate that we had going. Um, Now, as we go down, as we go to end this little debate, let's ask ourselves, can free speech be truly free if it allows harm to others? And where do you draw the line between robust debate and hate speech? Do anti vilification laws undermine or reinforce democratic principles? Now, the problem is, as you've heard during this debate, your free speech is very fragile in Australia. It's implied. I know we're going to have a lot of constitutionalist disagreements, but to be fair, it is very fragile in Australia, and it's implied. It's not an inalienable right, which is why we've got many people debating for Bill of Rights. But unfortunately, a federal Bill of Rights is virtually impossible because it'll override the Australian Constitution, which can be overridden by certain acts, which has happened in Victoria. Right. So at the end of this, right now, my thoughts and opinions are that certain things should be against the law, which is threats and violence, and but people shouldn't be afraid. I don't. The government shouldn't treat Australians like they're barbarians and don't know how to act in public, because that's exactly what the Victorian government is doing. I would like to come to a place where we can have open discourse and comedians and participate in debate and speech and stuff like that. If you don't like that speech, don't go. Don't go to it. Right? I remember my teacher a long time ago used to tell me that if you don't like the channel, don't bother complaining. Use the remote and change the channel because your viewership of that channel tells that you want more of that. Right. I think Australia is a lucky country apparently, but our laws are really bizarre that go against us being a lucky country. Look, I want Australia to get back to what it was, a beautiful country. It is beautiful. It's an amazing country. It's just we got politicians making really bad choices and policies at the moment. And they're not going to help. It's not. People are going to create troll accounts and they're going to start doing it online under false names and photos and whatnot going on. Right? Hopefully, Parliament will not allow this bill to go through. And hopefully, common sense prevails in Australia because Australians can be trusted. Jacinta Allen, please, us Australians can be trusted to act and live in a multicultural society because nobody, I'm going to guarantee you now that people walk down the street safe. They do, right? You're going to get somebody that says something to you. I lived half my life like that, right? You get over it, you know. But if you go with these laws, that will get worse. People will rebel against you and you'll create division. And we don't want that. We want unity. Please stop dividing Victorians, please. That's all we're asking. This has been Nick Reed for Daily Insights Debate. Hopefully, I'll do this again in the future soon. Thank you very much. Remember, please subscribe if you like and follow us. That way, I can see that you're engaging and want more of the content, and it helps me out to give you better, hopefully, debates and ongoing news, stuff like this. So, if you liked it, thank you very much. I'd love to see your comments and I might reply to them if I've got the time. Thank you very much once again, and it's been lovely having this debate.